Hello, everyone. I want to chat with you about emerging identities for Black people in the late 19th and 20th century. And the main things that I want you to take out of this conversation relate to ultimately the ability to define one's self for oneself. And so we start, of course, with the Audre Lorde quote, where she basically states that as clearly as you possibly can, being crunched into other people's fantasies for you, and then eaten alive. And so the unfortunate reality is that this is not something that is new, nor has it gone away. Unfortunately, the we as Black people deal more so with people's fantasies about us. And when you think of the term fantasy, obviously it tends to have positive connotations, but the reality is that most fantasies are actually negative in that regard. And so, in dealing with the representations of Black people in the United States before the Civil War, leading up to the Civil War, and then post Civil War, it lends itself to an opportunity to have those conversations about who we are and what that actually means for what we want to be. And so, with that said, I will proceed. So, today's conversation has three particular points. We are going to chat briefly about citizenship rights and how those were established for African Americans post Civil War. What it means to be a woman at this point, especially a Black woman in the United States. What it means to be Negro, again, which is the term that is contemporary related to when we are having this discussion. Obviously, it's not one that you want to use currently, but we have to uh, resist the temptation to be anachronistic and actually deal with the terms and the language and the conditions under which people lived at the time that the literature is being created. So, with those three um, aspects of it, hopefully you will gain an understanding of that self identification and the desire to self create and self define so that the identity that you have is one that you have autonomy over. So, with that said, before we go into citizenship and how those rights were achieved, let me just point out that obviously so far we have read the narratives of Frederick Douglass and of Linda Brent. And I want to um, always make sure that you have access to other resources in case you have an expanded interest in these things. And so, two other notable texts that you may not have heard about, but probably should read at some point, are Behind the Scenes 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, which was written by Elizabeth Keckley. Keckley was the modiste, which is a fancy dressmaker, not just dresses, but fancy dresses that included jewels and other baubles for Mrs. Lincoln. And so she was in the White House during President Lincoln's first term and would have continued with the Lincolns had he not been assassinated. In her text, we see lots of information about the Lincolns, especially Mrs. Lincoln's emotional state. And it was Keckley who was probably the first to diagnose her as having chronic depression. And so, some interesting things going on in that text. But overall, she had the Lincoln's ear. And so she was definitely a behind the scenes driving force behind getting President Lincoln to adopt certain aspects of legislature that would lead to citizenship for those who had formerly been enslaved. Keckley's life was not wonderful, as you can see, despite her achievements later on in life. Um, she unfortunately only had one son who was the product of a rape, and that was when she was a teenager, and so she had to try to raise her son on her own without very many resources in a society that viewed her in a very negative way. And so we'll see some additional aspects of that reality for her later on in later texts. But you also have the narrative of Solomon Northup, which is 12 Years a Slave. You may have actually heard of his. Notice also that we have heard of Frederick Douglass's narrative, but probably not of Linda Brent's. We have heard of Solomon Northup's narrative, but probably not Elizabeth Keckley's. There are some things going on in publications and in what gets promoted as far as Black trauma in the United States as well, even in the filmmaking. And so just take note of certain things as you read them. But Solomon Northup obviously wrote the narrative 12 Years a Slave because he had been born free and was kidnapped and sold into slavery in the South. And so we have documentation of what actually happened. Again, though, I caution you to not dive into that event pornography, and rather than focusing on these people's trauma, try to focus on their triumphs. So those are just two texts that I recommend if you have an interest in seeking more information. But to get back to the main point, citizenship after the Civil War was not a guarantee, because you have to remember that the rights of citizens included voting and property ownership and representation in court and things of that nature. Things that Black people, whether they were enslaved or free, did not typically have. And so you did have some examples of free Black people being able to acquire property and amass a certain amount of socioeconomic security in the United States. But for the most part, as then as is now, you see lots of legislature and lots of practices that make it almost impossible in order for people to achieve that certain level of security. And so one of the byproducts of the Civil War was that there were moves to grant the formerly enslaved and free Black people who had been born here citizenship rights. And so even though the 13th Amendment, which, Ava DuVernay's documentary focuses on it, actually technically abolished slavery, it was not until the 14th Amendment, which was pushed later, that we actually received the rights to engage in those citizenship processes. Now, just because one has the right, though, it doesn't mean that you're able to exercise that right, because again, you also see folks exercising loopholes to keep people out. But for the most part, the 14th Amendment granted Black people citizenship rights. So yes, you were born here. Yes, you've been here for generation after generation, but you're not a citizen until we define it. Because again, prior to that, only white men with land and other rights had the those rights to vote and for representation and land ownership and other things like that. And so it kind of seems oxymoronic that in order to own land, you have to own land. But yes, they created all sorts of situations that made it impossible for people to advance and to gain financial and social supports. So um, Keckley, in her work with the Lincolns, helped to advance that cause, and she did so underneath the umbrella of, or rather, the burden, the yoke, if you will, of the cult of true womanhood. And the cult of true womanhood was a social movement that essentially attempted to be prescriptive about women's behaviors and how they should be viewed and respected in society. And we see a lot of that even today. People, want to, we have terms for it. Um, uh, if you have a member of a cult of true womanhood, she would say, I cook and I clean and I am physically clean and I'm chaste and virtuous, virginal until I'm married. All of these, things that um, unfortunately Black women did not have access to, especially if you were enslaved. And so you don't have body autonomy. You don't have the ability to say no or to fight off your attackers. You don't have access. And we even see this if you watch the movie 12 Years a Slave. One of the women played by um, one of the women who was in the film actually mentioned that she did not have soap, that she stank. She smelled herself because she did not have access and was being kept from being clean. And so, again, you have this hierarchy that's being created that distinguishes women from other women. And they did so on purpose because prior to the cult of true womanhood, a lot of poor white women and enslaved Black women had a lot in common and would therefore collaborate to do a lot of things. And so we have narratives that demonstrate that. And so richer white women and richer white people, men as well, started to get a little concerned about all of these collaborations and sought to divide these groups. And so they wanted to make sure that the white women, whether they were poor or not, um, saw themselves as different from and therefore better than the Black women. And so you would have lots of conversations in public about that. And so they made sure, as part of the cult of true womanhood, that white women, when their husbands died, that they got widow payouts. Black women did not get receive such benefits. White women, when they worked outside of the home, were given days off so that they could tend to their families. That included pay. Of course, Black women did not receive those same benefits. And so you see all of these hierarchical, stratifying benefits to being white, whether you are poor or not. And so ultimately, what it proved by its own creation was that Black women were therefore not virtuous and not true women. And so you saw even in Truth's speech where she is pushing back against this notion of not being a true woman when the man, asks her if she's actually a woman, and she has to define that for him. And so, yes, neither Linda Brent nor Elizabeth Keckley would have been viewed as virtuous according to these standards. And it's unfortunate, but they had to their entire lives fight against those definitely stratifying standards. And then finally, you also have the new Negro, which again, I want to point out, it was already pointed out in the earlier notes, but Elaine Locke did not create the term new Negro. But instead, what he did was, in his essay, create a clear understanding of what it meant to be a Negro in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so, again, that attempt to self define rather than let someone else's definitions of you dictate your life. He wanted people to know, anyone who was interested in reading, that we had desires, that we had aspirations, that we had the intellect and the will and the industriousness and the creativity in order to achieve our goals. And as long as you stood out of our way, we could achieve those things. And so his definition of the new Negro was not only groundbreaking, but it was also freeing in that it created avenues for autonomy for the newly freed. Thank you.